On the morning of April 9, 1943, Lieutenant Carl Fischer stood at the edge of a supply depot outside Lyon, France, watching another convoy fail to arrive on schedule. The spring air carried the scent of diesel and fresh bread from a nearby bakery, an incongruous reminder that life continued even as the machinery of conflict ground relentlessly forward. Fischer had spent 7 years in logistics, managing supply chains that stretched from the factories of the Ruhr Valley to the furthest reaches of occupied territory, and he had never seen anything like the pattern of disruptions that had begun 3 months earlier. The German military leadership believed their supply networks were impenetrable, protected by overwhelming force, superior organization, and the most advanced communications technology of the era. They would be proven catastrophically wrong by a threat they never anticipated, could barely detect, and fatally underestimated until it was far too late. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one man's ingenuity, operating in the shadows with materials so simple they seemed almost laughable, brought the most sophisticated military supply system in Europe to its knees, and how the invisible became the most powerful weapon of all. Fischer consulted his clipboard for the 14th time that morning, his leather gloves creaking as his fingers tightened around the worn edges. The convoy from Dijon should have arrived 4 hours ago, carrying critical replacement parts for vehicles that sat idle across 3 departments. In the past week alone, 11 convoys had experienced unexplained delays. Not attacks, not sabotage in the conventional sense, but something stranger. Vehicles would simply stop working. Communications would fail at crucial moments. Entire supply chains would grind to a halt for reasons that seemed, on the surface, entirely mechanical and random. What Fischer could not have known, standing there in his perfectly pressed uniform with his meticulously maintained records, was that 140 kilometers away, a black American engineer named Samuel Morrison was at that very moment preparing another deployment of his revolutionary system. Morrison worked in near-total secrecy, even from his own commanders, developing a technique so unconventional that when he had first proposed it, his superior officers had thought he was joking. Morrison had arrived in England in August of 1942, part of a specialized unit of the Army Corps of Engineers. Before the conflict, he had worked for Bell Telephone in Philadelphia, where he had spent 12 years studying signal propagation, electromagnetic interference, and the invisible world of radio waves that increasingly governed modern communication. He was 34 years old, stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, and possessed a mind that saw connections others missed. His personnel file noted that he had published 7 technical papers on electromagnetic theory, though it also noted in the casual racism of the era that he was exceptionally articulate for his background. The idea that would transform him from an anonymous engineer into a strategic weapon had come to him during a routine briefing about the German supply network. An intelligence officer had been explaining how the German forces relied on precise coordination, with trucks, trains, and communication systems all working in perfect synchrony. The officer had emphasized the complexity of the system, its sophistication, its apparent invulnerability. Morrison had raised his hand and asked a question that changed everything. What if you did not need to destroy the vehicles or cut the communication lines? What if you could simply make them unreliable? What if you could introduce chaos so subtle, so difficult to diagnose, that the Germans would waste countless hours trying to fix problems that had no visible cause? The intelligence officer had stared at him for a long moment, then asked him to stay after the briefing. That conversation had led to a meeting with a colonel named Robert Hammond, who specialized in unconventional warfare. Hammond was a West Point graduate who had spent 3 years in the Philippines before the conflict, learning about insurgency and asymmetric tactics from locals who had perfected the art of resistance against a superior force. He recognized immediately that Morrison was describing something revolutionary, a form of sabotage that operated on principles no one had seriously considered. Hammond had given Morrison 3 months and a budget of $5,000 to prove the concept. Morrison had needed only 6 weeks. The system Morrison developed was breathtakingly simple, which was precisely why it worked. He called it the Phantom Wire Network. though that name would not appear in any official documents until decades after the conflict ended. The basic principle relied on a phenomenon that Morrison had studied extensively at Bell Telephone: electromagnetic induction. If you placed a wire near another wire carrying an electrical current, you could induce currents in that second wire without any physical connection. The effect was small, usually negligible, but Morrison had discovered that if you knew exactly where to place your wires, and if you made them from materials with very specific properties, you could create interference patterns that would disrupt electrical systems in ways that were almost impossible to diagnose. The genius of the system lay in its invisibility. Morrison did not cut wires or place explosives. Instead, he and his small team would identify key German supply routes, study the electrical characteristics of German military vehicles and communication equipment, and then deploy networks of extremely fine copper wire in patterns calculated to create maximum disruption. The wires were often no thicker than a human hair, strung between trees or buried just beneath the surface of roads. Positioned at angles and distances determined by complex mathematical calculations that Morrison performed by hand on sheets of graph paper that he filled with tiny, precise notations. When a German truck passed over or near one of Morrison's wire networks, strange things would happen. The electrical system might develop intermittent faults. The radio might pick up phantom signals or fail to transmit clearly. The engine might run rough, not enough to stop completely, but enough to reduce efficiency and speed. None of these effects were severe enough to obviously indicate sabotage. They simply made the vehicles unreliable, and unreliability in a system that depended on split-second coordination was deadlier than any bomb. By February of 1943, Morrison had deployed 17 separate wire networks across occupied France. Each network covered between 3 and 8 kilometers of road, positioned at locations carefully selected based on intelligence reports about German supply movements. The networks were maintained by a team of 6 French resistance fighters whom Morrison had personally trained, teaching them the principles of electromagnetic theory through patient demonstrations and hand-drawn diagrams that transcended language barriers. Morrison's operation was so secret that fewer than 30 people in the entire Allied command structure knew about it. This secrecy was partly for security, but also because Morrison's methods were so unconventional that many senior officers would have dismissed them as a waste of resources if they had been widely known. Hammond had become Morrison's protector and advocate, running interference with skeptical commanders and ensuring that Morrison had the freedom to operate according to his own judgment. The results spoke for themselves. German supply efficiency in the regions where Morrison operated had dropped by 42% since January. Maintenance hours on vehicles had increased by 317%. Communication reliability had plummeted, and the Germans had absolutely no idea what was causing it. Back at the depot outside Lyon, Fischer was beginning to suspect that something more systematic than random mechanical failure was at work. He was a methodical man, trained in the rigorous analytical traditions of German engineering education, and he could not shake the feeling that the patterns of disruption he was seeing were too consistent to be purely coincidental. But every time he tried to explain his concerns to his superiors, they dismissed him. The vehicles were old, they said. The French roads were poor. The mechanics were tired. Equipment failed. It was simply the nature of extended operations in occupied territory. Fischer had begun keeping his own records, separate from the official reports. He noted times, locations, types of failures, weather conditions, anything that might reveal a pattern. His wife, Helga, wrote to him from Bremen asking why his letters had become so distracted, filled with technical minutiae about vehicle maintenance schedules and communication frequencies. He did not know how to explain that he felt he was confronting a ghost, something that was destroying their operational effectiveness, but left no fingerprints, no evidence, nothing that he could point to and say, "There, that is the enemy." On the evening of April 9th, Fischer attended a briefing where a major named Wolfgang Schmidt presented statistics on operational efficiency. Schmidt was worried. Supply deliveries were running an average of 8 hours behind schedule. Fuel consumption had increased because vehicles were operating inefficiently. The communication network that was supposed to coordinate movements was proving unreliable at crucial moments. The cumulative effect was a logistics nightmare that was forcing commanders to hold larger reserves, deploy more vehicles, and allocate more personnel to maintenance and repair. Someone asked whether sabotage might be involved. Schmidt had shaken his head. There were no signs of it, he said. No explosives, no cut wires, no evidence of tampering. The resistance fighters in France were certainly active, but their tactics were crude, direct attacks on convoys and infrastructure. This was something different, something more subtle, and Schmidt admitted that he had no explanation for it. After the briefing, Fischer approached Schmidt privately and showed him the records he had been keeping. Schmidt studied them for a long time, his finger tracing routes on a map, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he looked up at Fischer and said something that stayed with Fischer for the rest of his life. "If this is sabotage," Schmidt had said, "it is being done by someone who understands our systems better than we understand them ourselves." Fischer had gone back to his quarters that night and written a detailed report, documenting every anomaly he could remember, cross-referencing times and locations, trying to find some pattern that would make sense of the chaos. He worked until 3 in the morning, filling page after page with careful notations, creating diagrams and charts that attempted to visualize what he was seeing. He never sent the report. The next morning, he received orders transferring him to a different region, routine rotation of personnel. His replacement was a younger officer who had spent most of his career in Berlin, managing supply depots far from the front lines. Fischer tried to brief him on the patterns he had observed, but the younger man was not interested. He had his own methods, his own ideas about how logistics should be managed. Fischer packed his belongings, said goodbye to the small staff he had worked with, and departed for his new assignment. As his car drove east through the French countryside, he looked out at the landscape, the trees and fields and small villages, and wondered what invisible forces were at work in this seemingly peaceful terrain. He was closer to one of Morrison's wire networks than he realized. In fact, his car passed within 50 meters of a particularly sophisticated installation that Morrison had deployed personally 3 weeks earlier. The installation covered 6 kilometers of road and incorporated innovations that Morrison had only recently developed, including the use of iron oxide particles mixed into the soil at specific depths to enhance the inductive effects. Morrison was, at that moment, 200 kilometers away in a farmhouse outside Reims, meeting with his French resistance contacts and planning his next deployment. The farmhouse belonged to a family named Dubois, who had been sheltering Allied operatives for 2 years. The father, Pierre, had been an electrician before the conflict, and he had proven to be Morrison's most capable student, grasping the principles of electromagnetic theory with an intuitive understanding that impressed even Morrison. Morrison sat at the kitchen table with Pierre and 3 other resistance fighters, studying maps and discussing locations. Morrison spoke French haltingly, relying heavily on Pierre to translate the technical concepts he was trying to convey. The maps were marked with pencil notations indicating German supply routes, communication towers, and depot locations. Intelligence gathered painstakingly over months by resistance networks that risked everything to provide it. Morrison pointed to a route east of Paris and explained, through Pierre's translation, why it was an ideal location for a new network. The route carried heavy traffic, including fuel tankers that supplied units operating further north. The terrain offered good concealment for wire installations, and most importantly, intelligence indicated that the Germans were already experiencing supply difficulties in that region, which meant that additional disruption would have an outsized impact on their operational effectiveness. Pierre's daughter, Marie, served ersatz coffee made from roasted chicory, a bitter brew that everyone drank without complaint because real coffee had been impossible to obtain for more than a year. She was 17 years old and served as a courier for the resistance, carrying messages and small items through the German checkpoints with a combination of innocent appearance and absolutely steady nerves. She had been stopped and questioned 11 times, but had never been caught, never broken, never given any indication that she was anything other than a local girl running errands for her family. Morrison thanked her for the coffee in his careful French, and she smiled at him with a warmth that transcended the language barrier. There was something about Morrison that inspired confidence in the people who worked with him. He was patient, respectful, willing to listen. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration when people did not immediately understand the complex technical concepts he was trying to explain. He treated everyone, regardless of background or education, as intelligent people capable of learning and contributing. The planning session lasted 3 hours. They discussed deployment strategies, maintenance schedules, contingency plans if the Germans began systematic sweeps of the roads. Morrison took copious notes in a small leather-bound journal that he kept with him at all times, filling pages with diagrams and calculations that would have been incomprehensible to anyone without advanced training in electrical engineering. At the end of the meeting, Pierre asked a question that Morrison had been anticipating. "Do you think they will ever figure out what we are doing?" Morrison had considered this carefully before answering. The honest answer was that eventually, probably, they would. The effects were too consistent, too patterned. Someone with the right training, the right analytical mindset, would eventually realize that the disruptions were not random mechanical failures, but something more systematic. When that happened, the Germans would begin looking for causes and they might find the wire networks. But Morrison also knew that even if the Germans discovered the networks, understanding how they worked would be a separate challenge. The physics of electromagnetic induction was well established, but applying it in this particular way, as a weapon of sabotage, was so unconventional that even Allied engineers had initially been skeptical. The Germans might find wires and still not understand what they were for or how they functioned. Morrison told Pierre that they should assume discovery was possible, but not imminent, and that they should continue operations as aggressively as possible, while the method remained secret. Every day that the Germans spent confused and frustrated was a day that Allied forces gained advantages elsewhere. Pierre had nodded, satisfied with this answer, and the meeting had concluded with plans for a deployment that would begin in 5 days. Morrison left the farmhouse after dark, traveling by bicycle along back roads that Pierre had assured him were rarely patrolled. The night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Morrison pedaled steadily, thinking about the mathematics of wire placement, the optimal angles for maximum inductive interference, the variables of vehicle speed and electrical current that determined whether a network would be effective or merely create minor annoyances. He thought about the German engineers who were surely at that very moment trying to diagnose the problems their systems were experiencing. Morrison felt a strange kinship with those unknown adversaries. They were, in their own way, his colleagues, trained in the same principles of engineering and problem-solving. In another world, another time, they might have worked together on some interesting technical challenge, collaborating on solutions to difficult problems. But this was not that world. This was a world where Morrison's expertise had been weaponized, where his understanding of invisible electromagnetic forces had been transformed into a tool of disruption and chaos. He did not take satisfaction in the confusion he was creating, but he did take pride in the elegance of his methods, the way he had turned abstract physics into practical effects that influenced events on a strategic scale. Morrison reached his safe house, a small apartment above a bakery in a village whose name appeared on no map that the Germans possessed. The baker, an elderly man named Bertrand, had lost 2 sons in the conflict and asked no questions about the quiet American who came and went at irregular hours. Bertrand simply provided shelter, asked Morrison if he needed anything, and occasionally left small parcels of bread that, while made from inferior flour stretched with sawdust and other substitutes, were nevertheless prepared with the skill of a lifetime of baking. Morrison climbed the narrow stairs to his room, lit a small oil lamp, and spent 2 hours reviewing his calculations for the upcoming deployment. The work required absolute precision. If the wires were placed even a few meters off from the optimal positions, the effects would be diminished. If the wire gauge was wrong, or if the materials had impurities that altered their electromagnetic properties, the entire network might fail to function. He worked methodically, checking each calculation multiple times, using a slide rule that he had owned since his student days at Howard University. The slide rule was a precision instrument made of mahogany and brass, its scales worn smooth from years of use. Morrison had once calculated that he had performed more than 100,000 calculations with this single tool, and he trusted it more than he trusted his own memory. At midnight, Satisfied that his plans were sound, Morrison extinguished the lamp and prepared for sleep. But sleep did not come easily. His mind continued working, turning over problems and possibilities, imagining the German engineers receiving reports of more disruptions, more inexplicable failures, more erosion of the efficiency they had worked so hard to achieve. Morrison did not hate the Germans. He had German colleagues at Bell Telephone, brilliant engineers who had fled their homeland when it became clear what direction their government was taking. He had attended conferences where German scientists presented groundbreaking research. He knew that on the other side of the lines there were men much like himself, educated, thoughtful, trapped in a system they might not have chosen but felt obligated to serve. What Morrison hated was the system itself, the ideology that had made this conflict necessary, the forces that had divided the world into sides and demanded that human beings use their talents for destruction rather than creation. He hated that his understanding of electromagnetic theory, which should have been used to improve communication systems and bring people together, was instead being used to disrupt and confuse. But he also understood that there were no clean hands in wartime, that everyone involved was compromised in some way, that the only meaningful question was which side would prevail and what world would emerge from the ashes. Morrison finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, and he dreamed of wires stretching across landscapes, invisible networks connecting everything to everything else, a web of electromagnetic forces that pulsed with meaning he could not quite grasp. 300 kilometers away, in a commandeered hotel in Paris that served as a logistics headquarters, Major Schmidt was having his own sleepless night. The statistics were undeniable. Something was systematically degrading the effectiveness of supply operations across a broad region. Schmidt had ordered comprehensive maintenance inspections, had brought in technical specialists from Berlin, had implemented new protocols for vehicle care and operation. Nothing had made any difference. Schmidt stood at his window, looking out at the occupied city, and wondered what he was missing. He was a trained logistician, had studied at the finest military academies, had managed supply chains in Poland and the Eastern Territories with remarkable efficiency. He understood systems, understood how to identify bottlenecks and optimize flows. But this was different. This felt like fighting an opponent who understood the rules better than he did, who was operating according to principles that Schmidt did not fully grasp. He thought about Fischer's report, the one the young lieutenant had shown him before his transfer. Fischer had been onto something. Schmidt was certain of it. The patterns were too consistent. But what could cause such widespread, systematic disruption without leaving obvious traces of sabotage? Schmidt resolved to request a team of specialists from Berlin, engineers with expertise in electrical systems and vehicle maintenance. If there was a systematic cause, they would find it. And once they understood the mechanism, they could develop countermeasures. What Schmidt did not know, could not have known, was that by the time those specialists arrived and began their investigations, Morrison would have deployed 4 additional networks, trained 3 more resistance cells in his methods, and expanded operations into regions that Schmidt had not even identified as vulnerable. The invisible war was accelerating, and Morrison was winning battles that would not be recognized or celebrated until long after the larger conflict had ended. In England, Colonel Hammond received Morrison's latest report and read it with growing admiration. The numbers were extraordinary. Conservatively, Morrison's operations had delayed German supply movements by more than 15,000 hours over the past 3 months. 15,000 hours of trucks sitting idle, of mechanics scratching their heads over problems they could not diagnose, of commanders waiting for supplies that did not arrive on schedule. Translated into military terms, that represented a significant degradation of operational capability, equivalent to removing dozens of vehicles from service without firing a single shot or losing a single Allied soldier. Hammond had begun advocating for expansion of the program. He wanted to deploy Morrison's methods in other theaters, wanted to train additional teams, wanted to transform Morrison's individual genius into a systematic Allied capability. But Hammond also knew that success bred attention, and attention could be dangerous. Already, some staff officers were asking questions about the special operations that Hammond was overseeing. There were whispers about unconventional methods, about resources being devoted to activities that produced no visible results. Hammond had to walk a careful line, providing enough information to maintain support while protecting the operational security that made Morrison's work possible. It was a delicate balance, and Hammond sometimes felt he was one briefing away from having the entire program shut down by commanders who wanted conventional results from conventional methods. Hammond pulled out a sheet of paper and began drafting a memo to his superiors, carefully crafting language that emphasized results while minimizing details about methods. He wrote about supply chain disruption, about operational delays, about enemy confusion and declining efficiency. He used the bureaucratic language that senior officers expected, turning Morrison's elegant physics into the crude metrics of military accounting. But as he wrote, Hammond allowed himself a small smile, because he knew that somewhere in occupied France, a quiet black engineer with a slide rule and a roll of copper wire was doing more damage to the German war effort than many entire battalions, and doing it in a way that would never appear in the history books, would never be celebrated in the newspapers, would never earn medals or recognition. Hammond suspected that Morrison would not have wanted recognition anyway. Morrison was a man who found satisfaction in solving problems, in elegant solutions to difficult challenges, in the quiet knowledge that his work mattered, even if no one outside a tiny circle would ever know about it. Hammond finished his memo, sealed it in an envelope marked with the highest security classification, and placed it in the outgoing mail. Then he returned to his desk and began planning how to expand Morrison's operation without compromising the secrecy that made it effective. The invisible war continued, wire by wire, calculation by calculation, one disrupted convoy at a time. The specialists arrived from Berlin on April 23rd, a team of 6 engineers led by a thin, intense man named Dr. Heinrich Vogel. Vogel had spent 15 years studying electrical systems for the German telecommunications industry and had authored 3 technical manuals that were considered definitive works in their field. Major Schmidt met them at the train station with a mixture of hope and apprehension. If anyone could solve this mystery, it would be Vogel and his team. Schmidt provided them with everything they requested: access to vehicles that had experienced problems, maintenance records, maps of routes where disruptions had been most frequent, technical specifications for all communications equipment. Vogel studied the materials with the methodical intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts, making notations in a leather journal that he kept buttoned inside his coat pocket. After 3 days of preliminary investigation, Vogel requested a meeting with Schmidt and his senior staff. The conference room was sparse, containing only a long wooden table, uncomfortable chairs and maps pinned to the walls. Vogel stood at the head of the table, his hands clasped behind his back, and delivered his initial assessment. The pattern of failures, Vogel explained, was highly unusual. The problems were not consistent with normal wear and tear, nor with sabotage in the conventional sense. There was something systematic about them, something that suggested an external influence rather than internal mechanical failure. Vogel had developed a hypothesis, though he admitted it sounded far-fetched. What if, Vogel asked, someone was using electromagnetic interference as a weapon? The room had gone silent. Schmidt leaned forward in his chair, his interest suddenly sharpened. Vogel continued, explaining the principles of electromagnetic induction. How currents in one conductor could induce currents in another without any physical connection. If someone knew the exact electrical characteristics of their vehicles and communications equipment, and if that person had access to very precise technical specifications, it might be theoretically possible to create interference patterns that would cause the kinds of problems they were experiencing. One of Schmidt's subordinates, a captain named Ernst Hoffmann, interrupted with obvious skepticism. Where would such interference come from? It would require equipment, power sources, technical knowledge that the French resistance simply did not possess. Vogel had smiled thinly. That was the elegant part, he said. It would not require sophisticated equipment at all. In theory, it could be done with nothing more than carefully placed wires, positioned at specific locations and angles to create inductive effects when vehicles passed nearby. Schmidt asked the obvious question: how would anyone know where to place such wires? Vogel's answer sent a chill through the room. Someone with access to their technical specifications, their vehicle designs, their communication frequencies, someone with advanced training in electrical engineering and electromagnetic theory, someone, in other words, who understood their systems as well as they understood them themselves. The implications were staggering. It meant that somewhere in the occupied territories, there was an enemy operative with extraordinary technical knowledge, working systematically to undermine their supply operations, using methods so subtle they had gone undetected for months. Schmidt authorized an immediate and comprehensive sweep of roads in the affected regions. Teams of engineers would examine every meter of roadway, looking for any signs of unusual wire installations or other equipment that might be creating electromagnetic interference. What Schmidt did not know was that Morrison had anticipated exactly this response. Morrison had been monitoring German activity through his resistance contacts, and when reports began filtering in about technical specialists arriving from Berlin, he knew his methods had finally attracted serious attention. He called an emergency meeting with Pierre Dubois and the other resistance fighters who maintained his networks. They met in a barn outside Chartres, a decrepit structure that smelled of old hay and mouse droppings. Morrison spread his maps across a makeshift table constructed from wooden planks and explained the situation. The Germans were going to start looking for the wire networks. Some would inevitably be discovered. Morrison's challenge was to make sure that even when networks were found, the Germans would not fully understand how they worked. Morrison had prepared for this contingency. He had developed what he called decoy networks, installations that looked similar to his functional systems, but actually did nothing at all. These decoys used thicker wire, more visible placements and configurations that would seem plausible but would not actually create effective electromagnetic interference. The strategy was psychological. When the Germans found the decoy networks, they would analyze them, attempt to understand their function, and might conclude that the entire phenomenon had been overestimated. Meanwhile, Morrison's real networks, which used much finer wire and more sophisticated placement strategies, would continue operating. Pierre listened carefully, then asked a question that demonstrated why Morrison valued his collaboration. Would it not be more effective to remove the real networks entirely until the German search efforts subsided? Morrison shook his head. The disruption they were causing was too valuable. Every day of continued operation meant more delays, more confusion, more erosion of German efficiency. The risk of discovery was acceptable if it meant maintaining that pressure. Marie Dubois, who had been listening quietly from the corner of the barn, spoke up. She suggested that they could actually use the German search efforts to their advantage. If resistance fighters knew where the German teams were conducting sweeps, they could ensure those teams found the decoy networks, guiding them away from the real installations. Morrison looked at the 17-year-old girl with renewed respect. It was a brilliant suggestion, turning a defensive situation into an opportunity for misdirection. Over the next 2 weeks, Morrison and his team deployed 8 decoy networks, while carefully maintaining and even expanding their real operations. Marie and other couriers passed information about German search patterns, allowing Morrison to stay one step ahead of Vogel's teams. Vogel's engineers did find wire installations, just as Morrison had intended. The first discovery came on May 7th, along a road south of Orleans. A search team uncovered approximately 200 meters of copper wire strung between fence posts in a configuration that seemed designed to create electromagnetic effects. Vogel examined the installation personally, taking careful measurements and documenting the wire placement with photographic equipment. He returned to Paris convinced that he had identified the source of their problems. The wire installation was crude but clever, he reported to Schmidt. It would indeed create some electromagnetic interference, though Vogel privately thought the effects were probably being overestimated. Schmidt ordered the removal of the wires and intensified search efforts across the entire region. Over the next month, Vogel's teams found and removed 12 more wire installations, each similar to the first. Vogel grew increasingly confident that they had solved the mystery and neutralized the threat. But the disruptions continued. In fact, they intensified. Morrison had used the German search operations as cover for his most aggressive deployment yet, installing 3 new networks in regions that Vogel's teams had already searched and cleared. The Germans, convinced they had found and removed all the wire installations, were not looking anymore. By mid-June, supply efficiency had dropped to 51% of normal levels in Morrison's operational area. The cumulative delays now exceeded 25,000 hours. Maintenance costs had doubled. German commanders were being forced to revise their logistical planning to account for systematic unreliability in their supply chains. And still, most of them did not understand what was happening. Vogel began to suspect that something was wrong. The problems should have decreased after they removed the wire installations, but if anything, they had gotten worse. He requested additional resources and authorization to expand his investigation, but resources were becoming scarce. The larger strategic situation was deteriorating. German forces were facing pressure on multiple fronts, and the High Command had more immediate concerns than unexplained logistics problems in occupied France. Vogel's requests were denied. He was told to make do with what he had and to stop requesting additional personnel and equipment. Frustrated but persistent, Vogel continued his investigation alone. He began traveling to sites where disruptions had been reported, examining roads personally, taking electromagnetic readings with portable equipment he had requisitioned from telecommunications facilities, and slowly, painstakingly, he began to realize that the wire installations they had found were not sophisticated enough to create the effects they were experiencing. Someone had deceived them. Vogel reached this conclusion on July 3rd, sitting in a requisitioned office in Tours, staring at technical diagrams and measurement data that refused to align with his theories. The decoy installations had been exactly that, decoys. The real system was still operating, using methods more subtle than what they had discovered. Vogel felt a strange emotion that he had not experienced in years, genuine admiration for an opponent. Whoever was behind this understood not just electromagnetic theory, but also psychology, understood how German engineers would think and respond, understood how to exploit their assumptions and lead them to false conclusions. Vogel wrote a detailed report outlining his new understanding and recommending a completely different approach to the search efforts. He delivered the report personally to Schmidt on July 8th. Schmidt read it carefully, his face growing more troubled with each page. Then he set the report down and told Vogel something that the engineer had not known. The situation in occupied France was becoming untenable. Resistance activity was increasing. Allied forces were applying pressure. Resources that might have been devoted to logistics investigations were needed elsewhere. Schmidt thanked Vogel for his work and told him that his services were no longer required. Vogel was being reassigned to Berlin, where his expertise would be better utilized on other projects. Vogel returned to his quarters that night and burned all his notes, all his calculations, all the evidence of his investigation. If the High Command did not want to hear what he had discovered, he would not preserve the documentation of their failure. But before he burned the documents, Vogel took one final action. He wrote a letter addressed to no one, a technical paper that described in precise detail what he had learned about electromagnetic warfare and how it could be used as a tool of sabotage. He sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it to himself at his home in Berlin, and posted it in the military mail system. The letter never arrived. It was lost somewhere in the chaos of wartime mail delivery, another small piece of knowledge that disappeared into the void. Morrison learned about Vogel's reassignment through Pierre's intelligence network. The news brought mixed emotions. Morrison had developed a grudging respect for the German engineer who had come so close to understanding his methods. In another world, they might have been colleagues, might have collaborated on technical problems, might have published papers together. But this was the world they inhabited, and Vogel's departure meant that Morrison could operate with even greater freedom. Through the summer and fall of 1943, Morrison expanded his operations systematically. He trained 4 additional resistance cells, deployed 17 new networks, and refined his techniques based on accumulated experience. He developed methods for creating even finer wires, using chemical processes that reduced copper strands to thicknesses that were nearly invisible to the naked eye. He experimented with different positioning strategies, discovering that certain angles and placements created interference patterns that were almost impossible to diagnose. The German supply system in occupied France was slowly collapsing under the weight of accumulated inefficiencies. Commanders adapted by building larger supply cushions, by allowing more time for deliveries, by accepting lower levels of coordination and precision. But these adaptations came at enormous cost, requiring additional vehicles, additional fuel, additional personnel, all resources that could not be used elsewhere. Morrison's invisible war was having effects that rippled far beyond the immediate disruptions. German strategic planning was being constrained by logistics limitations that military leaders could not fully explain. Operations were delayed. Offensive capabilities were reduced. The entire apparatus of occupation was becoming less effective, ground down by 10,000 small failures that no one could prevent. In December of 1943, Morrison received orders to return to England for consultation. Colonel Hammond wanted to brief him on expansion plans and discuss how his methods might be applied in other theatres of operation. Morrison travelled by submarine, a cramped and uncomfortable journey that took 3 days. He spent the time reviewing his notes, preparing documentation of everything he had learned, creating training materials that could be used to teach others his techniques. When Morrison arrived in London, Hammond greeted him personally at the dock. The colonel looked older than Morrison remembered, worn down by 2 years of constant pressure and responsibility. But his eyes lit up when he saw Morrison, and he shook the engineer's hand with genuine warmth. They met in a secure facility in central London, a nondescript building that housed various special operations planning offices. Hammond had assembled a small group of senior officers who had been briefed on Morrison's work and wanted to hear directly from him about his methods and results. Morrison spent 3 hours presenting his techniques, using a chalkboard to illustrate the principles of electromagnetic induction, showing photographs of wire installations, explaining the mathematical calculations that determined optimal placement. The officers listened with varying degrees of comprehension, some grasping the concepts immediately, others clearly struggling with the technical complexities. At the end of the presentation, a brigadier general named Thomas Whitmore asked the question that Morrison had been anticipating. "Can this be replicated? Can we train other teams to do what you have done?" Morrison answered carefully. "The techniques could be taught," he said, "but they required a specific combination of skills. Advanced knowledge of electromagnetic theory, precise mathematical ability, understanding of mechanical and electrical systems, and perhaps most importantly, the patience and creativity to apply abstract principles to practical situations." Whitmore pressed the question, how many people with those skills could the Allied forces realistically identify and train? Morrison had given this considerable thought. His honest assessment was that there were probably fewer than 100 people in the entire Allied military with the necessary technical background and aptitude. Of those, perhaps 20 or 30 could be trained to operate effectively in the field. It was not a scalable solution. Morrison's methods worked because of his unique expertise and his meticulous attention to detail. Mass deployment would be difficult, perhaps impossible. Hammond had anticipated this answer and had already developed an alternative strategy. Instead of trying to replicate Morrison's individual operations on a large scale, they would focus on a few high-value targets where Morrison's methods could have outsized impact. The discussion shifted to target selection. Intelligence officers presented briefings on German supply networks in various theaters, identifying routes and facilities where electromagnetic disruption might be particularly effective. Morrison listened carefully, asking questions about electrical infrastructure, vehicle types, communication systems, all the technical details he needed to assess feasibility. The meeting concluded with a decision to deploy Morrison to northern Italy in the spring, where German supply lines were stretched thin and vulnerable to disruption. Morrison would have 3 months to prepare, train a small team, and develop site-specific strategies. Morrison spent the winter in England working 18-hour days to document his methods, create training materials, and prepare for the Italian operation. He collaborated with other engineers, sharing knowledge that had previously existed only in his head and his notebooks. He developed simplified versions of his most complex calculations, creating charts and tables that would allow less mathematically sophisticated operators to achieve reasonable results. It was during this period that Morrison finally received recognition for his work, though in the secretive manner characteristic of special operations. Colonel Hammond presented him with a commendation, signed by officers whose names Morrison did not recognize, acknowledging his extraordinary contribution to the war effort. The commendation was classified at the highest level and would remain so for decades. Morrison accepted the recognition with quiet satisfaction, but no illusions. He knew that his work would never be publicly acknowledged, that his name would never appear in newspaper accounts of the conflict, that he would return to civilian life with no tangible evidence of what he had accomplished. And that was acceptable. Morrison had not undertaken this work for recognition, but because he possessed skills that were needed, because he could contribute in ways that others could not, because the cause was just, even if the methods were shadowy. The Italian operation launched in April of 1944 and proved even more successful than the French campaign. Morrison deployed networks across key supply routes in the Po Valley, creating systematic disruptions that contributed to the general degradation of German logistics in the theater. By August, when Allied forces broke through the German defensive lines, Morrison's invisible attacks had already eroded the enemy's ability to maintain cohesive supply operations. After Italy, Morrison was assigned to operations in southern France as Allied forces advanced from the Mediterranean coast. His methods evolved continuously, incorporating new techniques and responding to German countermeasures. The cat-and-mouse game continued until the final months of the conflict, with Morrison always staying one step ahead of efforts to detect and neutralize his systems. When the conflict in Europe ended in May of 1945, Morrison had deployed more than 70 separate wire networks across 3 countries. Conservative estimates suggested his operations had delayed German supply movements by more than 150,000 hours, equivalent to removing several hundred vehicles from service permanently. But perhaps more importantly, Morrison had pioneered an entirely new form of warfare, demonstrating that sophisticated technical knowledge could be weaponized in ways that were nearly undetectable and extraordinarily difficult to counter. His work laid groundwork for electronic warfare capabilities that would become increasingly important in subsequent decades. Morrison returned to the United States in July of 1945 and resumed his position at Bell Telephone. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service, honoring the classification that covered his operations. His personnel file simply noted that he had served with distinction in Europe, a bland phrase that conveyed nothing of what he had actually accomplished. In the years after the conflict, Morrison continued his work in telecommunications, contributing to the development of technologies that transformed American life in the post-war era. He married in 1948, had 3 children, lived a quiet life in a Philadelphia suburb. His neighbors knew him as a courteous, reserved man who worked for the telephone company and kept a beautifully maintained garden. Only a handful of people knew that Samuel Morrison had been one of the most effective saboteurs of the entire conflict, a man whose mathematical genius and creative insight had disrupted enemy operations on a strategic scale, while leaving almost no trace of his activities. Colonel Hammond remained Morrison's advocate and friend for the rest of his life. After the conflict, Hammond wrote a classified history of special operations in which he devoted an entire chapter to Morrison's work, documenting techniques and results in careful detail. The history remained classified until 1993, when portions were finally declassified and released to researchers. Even then, most of Morrison's story remained secret. The full technical documentation of his methods stayed classified, deemed still relevant to current electronic warfare capabilities. Morrison himself was mentioned only briefly, identified as an Army Corps of Engineers officer with specialized technical knowledge. Morrison lived to see the 50th anniversary of the conflict's end, attending a veterans gathering in Philadelphia, where old soldiers shared stories and memories. No one at the gathering knew what Morrison had done, what battles he had won in the shadows, using nothing but copper wire and mathematical calculations. Morrison died in 1998 at the age of 89. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer noted his 40-year career at Bell Telephone and his service during the conflict, but provided no details about his wartime activities. His children knew he had done something important in Europe, but had never learned the specifics, respecting their father's reticence about wartime experiences. It was not until 2006, when additional classified documents were released, that researchers began to piece together the full story of Morrison's operations. Even then, much remained unclear. Morrison's personal notebooks had been destroyed after his clearance expired, and many of the people who had worked with him were no longer alive to provide first-hand accounts. Pierre Dubois, the French electrician who had been Morrison's most capable collaborator, survived the conflict and returned to his trade in Reims. He never forgot the quiet American who had taught him to see electricity as a weapon, who had trusted him with knowledge that most engineers guarded jealously. Pierre told his grandchildren stories about the resistance, carefully edited to remove classified details, and always emphasized that the greatest heroes were often the ones whose names never appeared in history books. Marie Dubois, who had served as a courier and had suggested the brilliant stratagem of using German search efforts against themselves, became a teacher after the conflict. She taught mathematics and physics, inspiring generations of students with her belief that technical knowledge was power, that understanding the invisible forces of nature could change the world. Neither Pierre nor Marie ever fully understood the complete scope of what Morrison had accomplished. They knew he had disrupted German supply lines, but they did not know about the strategic impact, did not know how Morrison's invisible war had influenced operations across entire theaters, did not know that military historians would eventually identify his work as one of the most effective sabotage campaigns in modern warfare. Dr. Heinrich Vogel, the German engineer who had come closest to understanding Morrison's methods, survived the conflict and returned to work in the telecommunications industry in West Berlin. He never spoke publicly about his wartime investigation, but he occasionally published technical papers on electromagnetic interference that hinted at knowledge gained through bitter experience. Colleagues noted that Vogel had an almost obsessive interest in the invisible forces that connected electrical systems, as if he had glimpsed something profound that continued to fascinate him decades later. Major Carl Fischer, the logistics officer who had first noticed the pattern of disruptions, was reassigned multiple times during the final 2 years of the conflict and ended up in a prisoner of war camp in France after the collapse of German forces. He returned to Germany in 1947 and worked as an accountant in Bremen until his retirement. Fischer never learned what had caused the mysterious problems that had plagued his supply operations, never knew that his careful observations and detailed record-keeping had been remarkably accurate, never discovered that he had been confronting a ghost who operated according to principles that Fischer's training had not prepared him to recognize. The story of Samuel Morrison and the invisible wire networks remained fragmentary and incomplete, scattered across classified documents, fading memories and gaps in the historical record. But the impact of his work was undeniable. Morrison had demonstrated that warfare could be waged in dimensions that most commanders never considered, that technical expertise could be as powerful as conventional weapons, that one person with deep knowledge and creative thinking could influence events on a strategic scale. Morrison's legacy extended far beyond his wartime operations. His techniques influenced the development of electronic warfare capabilities that became central to military doctrine in subsequent decades. His understanding of how to weaponize electromagnetic phenomena contributed to technologies that would shape conflicts from Korea to the present day. But perhaps Morrison's most important legacy was the example he set, that brilliance could emerge from unexpected places, that those who were marginalized or overlooked by conventional society could nevertheless contribute in extraordinary ways, that intelligence and creativity recognized no boundaries of race or background. Morrison had worked in the shadows, had accepted that his achievements would never be publicly celebrated, had returned to ordinary life with no expectation of recognition. But he had known, in the quiet satisfaction that sustained him through his later years, that he had made a difference, that his skills had mattered, that he had helped tip the balance in a conflict where the stakes could not have been higher. The invisible wires were long gone, removed or corroded, returned to the earth that had hidden them. But their effects rippled forward through time, shaping outcomes that changed the course of history, all because one black engineer had understood something that others had missed, that the most powerful weapons are often the ones no one can see, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.